Close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath in, and let it go. Feel your body sinking gently into whatever holds you right now. The weight of the day is lifting. One breath at a time. You don't need to think about tomorrow. You don't need to carry anything with you tonight. Not a single worry. Not a single task. Tonight, you are going to travel. Not across any distance you can measure. Not to any place you could point to on a map. You are going to travel through time, across the vast and ancient story of a land of rivers and mountains and endless sky, a land that has held more human dreams than perhaps any other place on earth. The story of America. And it begins long before anyone called it that, long before there were words for it at all. Let your breathing slow even further now. In through the nose. Slowly. Out through the mouth. Slowly. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands open gently at your sides. There is nothing to hold on to tonight. Only the story, only the quiet, only the drift towards sleep. Part 1. The first people imagined the earth as it was. 14,000 years ago. No cities. No roads. No sound of engines or voices carried through wires. Only the wind. And the water. And the endless conversation between the sky and the land. The continents stretched in all directions. Ancient, beyond any reckoning. Mountains that had stood for millions of years. Rivers that had carved their paths through solid stone over centuries beyond counting. Forests so vast and so dense that the light never reached the ground in some places. And the animals, creatures we would not recognize today. Mammoths moving slowly through the tall grass of the great plains. Giant ground sloths, the size of elephants. Horses. America had horses then, before they disappeared. Long before Europeans brought them back. Saber-toothed cats howling the edges of ancient forests. A world so full of life that it would seem almost impossible to us now. And then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, people came, not with fanfare, not with intention, only with the ancient, unstoppable human impulse to move. To follow the food. To find the next valley. To see what lay beyond the next ridge, across a narrow bridge of land that connected two great continents. A bridge that the rising sea would eventually swallow. But for a time, it was there. And people walked across it. A family. Then another family. And another. Generation after generation. Moving slowly south. Following herds. Following rivers. Following something deep inside them that said. Keep going. There is more ahead. These were not explorers in any sense we would recognize. They carried no maps. They had no notion of what they were doing in any grand historical sense. They were simply living. As people have always simply lived. Day by day. Step by step. And over thousands of years. The land filled with people. millions of people, hundreds of distinct nations and peoples, each one shaped by the land they had come to call home. In the frozen north, the Inuit and the Yupik learned to read the sea, ice the way others read the stars. They built boats from animal bones and stretched skin, kayaks so perfectly designed that modern engineers still marvel at them. They hunted whales in open ocean water, in vessels that weighed almost nothing, armed with patience and knowledge passed down across uncountable generations. On the Great Plains, nations of hunters followed the bison, vast herds that darkened the horizon. 40 million animals moving across the grass like a slow brown river. The people who followed them developed an intricate relationship with the land. They knew every hill, every water source, every shift in the wind. That told them where the herd was moving. They were not simply hunting. They were participating in a world they understood deeply. World they saw themselves as part of, not above, not separate, but woven into. In the Pacific Northwest, the cedar forests came down to the very edge of the sea, and the people there built great houses from the wood of those trees. Houses that could hold entire extended families. They carved tall poles that told the stories of their people, their history encoded in the language of image and symbol, standing against the gray sky. Salmon ran so thick in the rivers that a person could almost walk across them. The people gave thanks for each one. They understood that what the river gave, the river could also take away, and so they tended the river, the way a gardener tends a garden. In the desert Southwest, where the sun hammered the red earth from a sky that seemed almost too blue to be real, people built cities into the faces of cliffs, multi-story dwellings that clung to canyon walls, sheltered from the burning summer sun above, open to the winter light below, at a piece of architecture so perfectly adapted to its environment that it has never truly been improved upon. And in the warm, wet South, in the jungles of what would one day be called Mexico, cities rose from the earth that rivaled anything been standing in the old world. The Olmec first, carving enormous stone heads from volcanic rock, heads taller than a man, representing rulers, or gods, or perhaps both, transported across impossible distances by a people who had no wheel, no metal tools, only labor, and will, and the extraordinary human capacity for organized effort. Then the Maya, who looked at the sky with a patience and precision that seems almost supernatural. They tracked the movements of Venus. They calculated the length of the solar year to a degree of accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. They built a mathematical system that included the concept of zero. Centuries before it appeared in the Old World, they wrote, in a complex system of symbols carved into stone and painted on bark paper, books that recorded history and astronomy and ritual and story. most of which were burned by Spanish priests who thought them the work of the devil. A loss to human knowledge that cannot be measured, and the Aztec Dot who built their capital city, Tenochtitlan, on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the shore by great causeways. A city of canals and floating gardens, of temples and markets and schools. A city of perhaps 200,000 people, larger than any city in Europe at the time, where merchants sold cacao and jade and feathers of impossible colors, where craftspeople worked gold and obsidian and cotton cloth, where priests climbed the steps of great pyramids at dawn to greet the sun. Let that image settle into your mind. This city on a lake dot built by human hands, rising from the water like a dream, the smell of flowers. Drifting from the gardens dot the sound of water, the sound of a great civilization at rest in the evening. Children sleeping, fires dying down dot the stars, coming out one by one above the mountains. This was the world that existed before the sails appeared on the horizon. A world that had been building itself for 14,000 years. Quietly dot beautifully dot independently dot dash. Part 2. The Age of Sails in the year 1492. A man named Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of a small wooden ship dot and watched the horizon. He had been watching it for weeks of nothing but water in every direction. His crew was frightened. Some of them were angry. Some of them whispered among themselves that they should turn back, that they had sailed too far, that the world ended somewhere ahead of them. Columbus was not a gentle man. He was ambitious and stubborn and capable of great cruelty. But he was also something that the world occasionally produces. A person so fixed on an idea dot so unwilling to accept that what he wanted was impossible, that he simply kept going, past the point where most people would have stopped. On the morning of October 12th, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, climbing in the rigging of the Pinta, just before dawn dot saw something. A line of white dot cliffs dot land dot he shouted it out dot TIERRA dot land. When Columbus stepped ashore dot, the people who came to meet him on the beach were curious and open. They brought gifts. They touched the strange men's clothing and their metal weapons with wonder. Columbus wrote in his journal that they were kind and generous, that they would make excellent servants, that they would be easy to conquer. He wrote all of this down by candlelight in his small cabin on the ship that same night, while the people who had greeted him slept in their villages nearby, not knowing what those words would mean. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas dot he never understood where he had been. He died believing he had reached Asia, but the world he had stumbled upon would absorb everything Europe had, its people, its ambitions dot its religions, its diseases, because behind Columbus came the diseases invisible, silent, traveling, with the new arrivals in their blood and their breath smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Diseases that the people of the Americas had never encountered, against which they had built no immunity across any of their generations. In some places, entire populations were gone within a generation. Villages that had stood for centuries. Silent, empty, the crops still growing in the fields. The dogs still waiting at the doors of houses, but no voices, no footsteps, no children. Historians estimate that somewhere between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century following first contact, numbers that are difficult to hold in the mind. Tens of millions of people gone, the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. And the land itself changed. The great forests of the eastern coast began to grow back over fields that had been farmed for centuries. European explorers, who came later, wrote that they were arriving in a wilderness, a virgin land, empty and waiting. They did not understand that the emptiness they saw was not natural. It was a wound. Let that understanding settle gently. Not with guilt that disturbs your sleep, but with the quiet, important recognition that every story has layers, that what looks like a beginning is often also an ending, that history is not a single thread, but a vast and tangled fabric. Part 3. The Spanish world. The Spanish came first, and they came with a particular combination of qualities that made them extraordinarily effective colonizers. Religious conviction, military skill, and an almost total indifference to suffering that was not their own. Hernan Cortes arrived on the coast of Mexico in 1519 with 500 men, 16 horses, and several cannons. He was not supposed to be there. His expedition had been canceled by his superior, and so he burned his ships. To make retreat impossible, not just for his enemies, but for his own men. What followed was one of the most dramatic conquests in history. Court Iacutes forged alliances with the peoples who had been subjugated by the Aztec. He marched to Tenochtitlan and was received there by the Emperor Moctezuma with extraordinary ceremony and hospitality. Moctezuma housed him in a palace. Fed his men, gave him gifts of gold and jade. Cortes responded by taking Moctezuma prisoner in his own palace. Within 2 years, the empire was gone. The great city on the lake was reduced to rubble, and on its ruins, the Spanish began building Mexico City. In the north. Spanish explorers pushed into the deserts and canyons of what is now the American Southwest. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado led an expedition in 1540, looking for the legendary 7 cities of gold. Cities that existed only in rumor and imagination. He found instead the Grand Canyon, arguably more magnificent than any city made of gold. though he didn't see it that way. He was looking for wealth he could carry, not beauty he could only stand before. The Spanish built a colonial empire that stretched from the tip of South America to the missions and ranches of California. They brought cattle and horses and wheat, and they brought the church, which was both a source of genuine comfort to some dot and a mechanism of control and violence for others. In the missions of California, Franciscan friars gathered the indigenous people into communities where they were converted to Christianity, taught European crafts and agriculture, and in many cases, prevented from leaving, punished for practicing their own spiritual traditions, working the land and tending the cattle under conditions that amounted to forced labor. The population of California's indigenous people, which had been perhaps 300,000 before contact, would fall to fewer than 20,000 by the late 19th century. But even in the darkness of colonial history, there were voices of dissent. A Dominican friar named Bartolome de las Casas, who had participated in the conquest of Cuba, and had owned enslaved people himself, underwent a conversion, not a religious one, but a moral one. He spent the rest of his life writing and arguing that the indigenous people of the Americas were full human beings, with rights, with souls, with dignity that could not be stripped from them. He was largely ignored by the colonial authorities, but his words survived. Small light in a very dark time. Part 4. The English arrive while Spain was building its empire in the south. England was slow to join the competition, distracted by its own religious conflicts, its own internal struggles. It wasn't until the late 16th century that English attention turned seriously to the western shore of the Atlantic. The first English attempts at settlement failed. A colony established on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina, in 1587, simply vanished. 115 men, women, and children there one day, gone the next. The only clue, a single word carved into a tree: Croatoan, the name of a nearby island and people. Whether the colonists joined the Croatoan people, whether they died, whether they were taken or left of their own will, nobody has ever known with certainty. The lost colony of Roanoke remains one of American history's most enduring mysteries, and perhaps its most haunting beginning. The next English attempt was more permanent. In 1607, a group of settlers sponsored by the Virginia Company, a joint stock company looking for a return on its investment, arrived on the coast of Virginia. They chose a marshy peninsula on a river they named the James, and they built a fort. Jamestown. The first permanent English settlement in what would become the United States. The early years were catastrophic. The location they had chosen was poor. The water was brackish and sickening. The land was swampy, and difficult to farm. Many of the settlers were gentlemen, men who had never done hard physical labor in their lives, men who expected servants and comfort, who found instead mud and disease and hunger. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, a period that survivors called the starving time, the settlement of 500 people fell to 60. 60 survivors living inside their fort, too weak to bury their dead, too frightened to go outside the walls. They were saved in part by a complex and shifting relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy. The alliance of nations that controlled the Chesapeake region, led by a chief named Wahunzinek, who the English called Powhatan. The relationship between the English settlers and the Powhatan people was never simple. There were periods of trade and relative peace, and there were periods of brutal violence. A young woman named Amanut, known to history as Pocahontas, daughter of Honsinek, was taken hostage by the English in 1613, converted to Christianity, given the name Rebecca, and married to a tobacco farmer named John Rolfe. She traveled to England, where she was presented at the court of King James, where she sat for a formal portrait in English dress, looking out from the canvas with an expression that is impossible to read. She died in England in 1617 at approximately 21 years of age, never having returned home. But Jamestown survived because of tobacco. The world wanted it so much that the colonists planted it in the streets, in every available patch of ground. And Virginia grew rich on the back of that appetite. The problem with tobacco was that it needed labor. Enormous amounts of labor. Planting, tending, harvesting, curing. At first, the Virginia colonists tried using indentured servants, poor men from England who agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World and the promise of land when their service was done. But indentured servants eventually became free. And free men with land could become competitors, could become troublemakers, could become the kind of people who demanded rights. And so the colonists looked south to the slave trade that the Portuguese and Spanish had already established along the coast of Africa. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, brought by a Dutch ship, sold to the colonists. The beginning of something that would define and deform. American life for centuries to come. Part 5. The Pilgrims and the Puritans. Let your body grow heavier now. Let your breathing deepen. We are moving northward along the coast. To a cold harbor. In the gray light of a November morning. In the year 1620, the Mayflower was a merchant vessel. Not designed for passengers. And certainly not for the crossing of an October Atlantic. It was 108 feet long. Its hold was dark and wet and smelled of the tar and bilge water. that had accumulated over years of ordinary commercial voyages. 102 people were crammed into it. For a crossing that took 66 days, they were a mixed group. About half of them were separatists, a religious group who had broken from the Church of England, who had spent years in exile in the Netherlands, seeking the freedom to worship in their own way. They were serious, devout, difficult people who believed that they were on a mission from God. The other half were simply people looking for a new start. Craftspeople and workers and adventurers. Ordinary people with ordinary hopes. Who the separatists called strangers, which tells you something about how warmly they felt toward each other. The crossing was brutal. Storms that forced everyone below decks for days at a time. The ship rolling and pitching in the darkness. People sick and frightened and praying. A young man named John Howland was swept overboard during a storm. And was saved only because he managed to grab a rope, trailing in the water. And held on long enough to be pulled back aboard. He would survive to father 10 children and 88 grandchildren, including many generations later, both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. When they finally sighted land, it was not where they had planned to go. They had aimed for Virginia, but storms and error had carried them far to the north. To the coast of what is now Massachusetts. And here they did something remarkable. Before anyone set foot on shore. 41 of the men gathered in the hold of that small, damp, terrible ship, and they wrote the document, the Mayflower Compact. In which they agreed to govern themselves. To make fair and equal laws. To act together for the general good. It was a small thing. Written in cramped handwriting by cold and exhausted men. In a ship that smelled of illness and salt water. But it contained a seed. The seed of the idea that people could choose their own form of government. That authority came not from a king or a church, but from the consent of the governed. A seed that would take more than a century to fully flower. But it was there, already there. In the winter darkness of that harbor. The first winter nearly destroyed them. Half of them died. Of exposure. Of scurvy. Of pneumonia. Of despair. They were saved in the spring. By a man named Tisquantum. Called Squanto by the English. A Wampanoag man who had been kidnapped by English traders years before, taken to Europe. Sold into slavery in Spain. Escaped. Made his way to England, and eventually found passage back to his homeland, only to find that his entire village had been destroyed by epidemic, disease in his absence. Every person he had known. Gone. He was the last of his people, alone in the land of his birth. And yet this man, who had every reason to hate the English, who had been enslaved by them, who had lost everything to the diseases they carried, came to the struggling settlement at Plymouth Dot and taught the survivors to plant corn dot, to fertilize the soil with fish, to find food in the forest and the sea dot. He taught them how to survive. The following autumn, the survivors held a 3-day feast dot to give thanks for their harvest dot for their survival dot. They invited the Wampanoag people who had helped them. Around 90 native men came, along with their leader, ISSOIT, that they ate, and they played games, and they gave thanks dot together, dot for a few days, at least dot two very different peoples, sharing a table in the autumn light. Part 6. 13 colonies becoming a nation more than a century past. The English colonies grew and multiplied along the Atlantic coast, from the cold harbors of Massachusetts dot to the warm tobacco fields of Virginia, dot to the proprietary colonies of Pennsylvania and Maryland, dot to the rice plantations of South Carolina. Each colony had its own character, its own economy, its own particular way of being in the world. But they shared a language, shared a legal tradition, shared, gradually, a sense of themselves as something distinct, something that was neither English nor yet anything else with a name. The colonists read dot and argued dot and debated dot. They were, on average, more literate than people in England, more likely to own land, more accustomed to having a voice in their local government. And then England began asking them for money dot after the long, inexpensive French and Indian War, which had been fought partly to protect the colonists themselves. Parliament decided it was only fair for the colonies to help pay the debt, and so the taxes came. The Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed every piece of printed paper in the colonies. Legal documents dot newspapers, dot even playing cards. The colonists were furious, not just about the money dot, but about the principle. They had no representatives in the parliament that had passed this tax, dot no voice in the decision, and the cry went up across the colonies. No taxation without representation. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but followed it with others dot taxes on glass, on lead, on paint, on paper dot on tea, and the tea tax provoked the most famous act of colonial defiance. On a cold night in December 1773, a group of colonists, some of them members of a secret organization called the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and crept quietly down to Griffin's Wharf in Boston Harbor, where 3 British ships were anchored, ships that had been sitting there for weeks, their holds full of East India Company. T.T. that the colonists refused to allow unloaded until the tax was removed. In the darkness, working quickly and quietly, the men boarded the ships, split open 342 wooden crates, and threw the contents into the harbor. More than 90,000 pounds of tea, worth, in modern terms, perhaps $1 million, dissolving in the cold black water of Boston Harbor. The British response was swift and punishing. They closed Boston's port, banned town meetings, required colonists to house British soldiers in their homes. The colonies called these the Intolerable Acts, and they began, for the first time, to truly act together. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress. Men who barely knew each other, from very different places with very different interests, trying to figure out what to do together. The shooting started the following April at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, where British soldiers marching to seize a colonial weapons cache encountered armed militiamen and someone, nobody knows who, fired the first shot. A shot heard round the world. By the time the Second Continental Congress gathered in May 1775, a war was already underway, and the delegates faced a decision that had been building for years, but that none of them had quite expected to have to make. A committee was appointed to draft a statement explaining why the colonies were breaking from Britain. The committee included John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, and a tall, quiet, red-haired man from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. They asked Jefferson to write the first draft. He was 33 years old. He sat in a rented room in Philadelphia, working by candlelight, choosing each word with extraordinary care. In 17 days, he produced a document that would change the world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776. 56 men signed it. In doing so, they committed treason against the British, crowned an act for which they could be hanged, and most of them knew it. Benjamin Franklin is said to have remarked as the delegates prepared to sign, "We must, indeed, all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Whether he actually said it or not, the sentiment was real. These men were not acting from safety. They were acting from conviction. And the war that followed would test that conviction severely. Part 7. The Revolution and its Aftermath. The Revolutionary War lasted 8 years. 8 years of cold, winters and scarce supplies, of victories and devastating defeats, of a continental army that was almost always outnumbered, almost always undersupplied, almost always on the edge of dissolution. George Washington was not a brilliant battlefield commander. He lost more battles than he won, but he possessed qualities that perhaps mattered more. Endurance, steadiness, the ability to hold his army together through hardships that would have broken most men. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge. Pennsylvania was perhaps the lowest point. The army arrived in December with inadequate clothing, inadequate food, inadequate shelter. The men slept in huts they built with their own hands from green wood, huts that let in the wind and the cold. They lacked shoes, they lacked blankets, they lacked meat. Men left bloody footprints in the snow. Washington rode among his men through those months. Visible. Present. Not retreating to comfortable quarters. Sharing something of what they endured. And slowly, against all logic, the army held together. The French alliance changed everything. France, still furious at Britain from the 7 Years' War, decided that supporting the American rebels was an excellent way to weaken its old enemy. French money. French soldiers, and crucially. The French fleet, tipped the balance. In October 1781. At Yorktown, Virginia. With French naval forces cutting off British retreat by sea. And American and French forces surrounding them on land. British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered. He was too proud to hand over his sword personally. He sent an aide, claiming to be ill. The American and French soldiers stood in 2 long lines, and the British marched between them, their band playing a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." It had been. The new nation now faced the harder task of governing itself. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government. Were weak by design. The founders were terrified of central authority, of another king in different clothing. And so they created a government that could barely function. In 1787. Delegates gathered again in Philadelphia. In secret, through a long, hot summer. To try again. The Constitutional Convention produced a document that has governed the United States now for more than 200 years, a remarkable achievement of compromise in principle and of carefully designed ambiguity. Ambiguity that would allow the document to survive and would sometimes make it nearly impossible to live under. The Constitution was ratified, but only with the promise that amendments would be added, protecting the rights of individual citizens against the power of the government. Not in 1791. The first 10 amendments were added. The Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. The right to a fair trial, the right to bear arms. Words that Americans have been debating, interpreting, and arguing about ever since Part 8, Expansion and its Costs. New nation pressed westward. With extraordinary speed. And with little regard for what, or who was already there. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803. In which President Thomas Jefferson bought 828,000 square miles of territory from Napoleon for $15 million, roughly 3 cents an acre, roughly doubled the size of the United States. Overnight Jefferson sent 2 men to explore it, Meriwether, Lewis and William Clark, who spent 2 years traveling from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean and back. A journey of approximately 8,000 miles through mountains and deserts and plains that no American of European descent had ever seen. They could not have done it without help. A young Shoshone woman named Scagawe, who joined the expedition while pregnant, carrying her infant son on her back, served as interpreter. As guide. As living proof to the 2 native nations they encountered that this was not a war party, because no war party would travel with a woman and a baby. She was paid nothing for her service, while the men around her received land grants and officers, commissions upon their return. The land was vast, and the hunger for it was insatiable. In the 1830s, the discovery of gold on Cherokee land in Georgia prompted the state of Georgia to begin seizing native territories. President Andrew Jackson, who had built his military reputation fighting native people, signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forcible relocation of the 5 civilized tribes from their homelands in the Yangtze, southeast to territory west of the Mississippi. Cherokee were removed in 1838 in the dead of winter. More than 16,000 people forced from their homes at gunpoint. Made to march more than 1,000 miles. In brutal cold. With inadequate food and clothing. 4,000 people died on the march. Perhaps more. The Cherokee called it Nunadal, Sioux-ny. The trail where they cried. History calls it the Trail of Tears. This pattern repeated itself across the continent. As the United States pushed its borders westward. Treaty after treaty made. Treaty after treaty broken. Nations pushed from their lands. Pushed again. And pushed again. Until there was nowhere left to push. In 1851. The Fort Laramie Treaty guaranteed the Lakota people sovereignty over the Black Hills of South Dakota, an area they considered sacred beyond any other. When gold was discovered there in 1874, the treaty was simply set aside. The conflict that followed reached its most famous moment. At a place called the Little Bighorn in Montana. In June of 1876. Where Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led the 7th Cavalry Regiment into an encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. Far larger than he had anticipated, led by men named Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, whose military genius exceeded his own. Custer and more than 260 of his men were killed in less than an hour. America was shocked. The nation that saw itself as the rightful heir to the continent. Had been decisively and humiliatingly defeated. The response was a military campaign of extraordinary force that eventually confined the surviving Plains nations to reservations, where they were expected to abandon everything that had made their culture. Everything. Let these facts rest gently in you, not as things to feel guilty about, not as things to feel angry about tonight, but as things to know, because knowing is the thing. Knowing is the STO, beginning of everything. Part 9. The wound that divided a nation through. All of this expansion. Through all the building and growing and reaching westward. The wound at the center of American life grew deeper. Slavery. The institution that contradicted every word of the Declaration of Independence. Grew more entrenched. Not less. As the decades passed. By 1860, nearly 4 million human beings, men, women, and children, lived in slavery in the American South. More enslaved people than existed in any other country on earth. The economy of the South was built on their labor. Cotton, that white fiber that fed the mills of England and New England, could not be grown without them. The great plantation houses, with their columned porches and their immaculate gardens. Were built by enslaved hands, maintained by maintained by Hod, enslaved hands, surrounded by the evidence of a prosperity that belonged entirely to those who had done none of the work to create it. Enslaved people resisted in every way they could. In small, daily acts of sabotage. In the preservation of culture and language and music. In the singing of spirituals that encoded messages and directions. And a theology of liberation. In open, rebellion. In escape. Nat Turner led a rebellion in Virginia. In 1831, 55 white people were killed. Turner was captured and executed, and the response across the South was a tightening. Hardening. New laws, making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read, making it illegal for them to gather without a white person present, making the walls of the institution higher and thicker and more cruel. But people still escaped, following the North Star, moving at night, hiding during the day in barns and basements and swamps, making their way north along the Underground Railroad. A network of abolitionists and free black people who hid fugitives and fed them and passed them from one safe house to the next. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland around 1822. She escaped in 1849, walking alone through the night. Following the stars, terrified and determined in equal measure. She arrived in Philadelphia. Free. And then she did something that still seems almost impossible to comprehend. She went back. She went back 19 times into the territory where she could be captured and returned to slavery. Or killed. Each time guiding a group of escaped enslaved people northward. She was armed, and she was not sentimental about what she would do if someone tried to turn back. If you are tired, keep going, she told the people she led. If you are scared, keep going. If you are hungry, Keep going. Never stop. Never give up. She freed more than 300 people, and she never lost a single one. She became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And then a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War, leading a raid that freed more than 700 enslaved people in a single night. A military operation of genuine skill and daring, for which she was not compensated during her lifetime, not given the pension she had earned. She died in 1913. At approximately 91 years of age, having outlived almost everything the political tension over slavery built for decades, compromise after compromise, each one buying a few more years of peace, not at the price of deeper contradiction. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each one more tortured than the last. Each one more obviously a temporary solution to a permanent problem. In 1857. The Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that enslaved people were property. Not citizens, not human beings in the eyes of the law, that they had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. Those were the actual words, written by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And in 1860, a lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln was elected president on a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. He was not an abolitionist. He had said many things about race during his career that reflected the prejudices of his time. But he believed the Union had to be preserved, and he believed slavery was a moral wrong. South Carolina seceded from the Union before he was even inaugurated, followed by 6 more states. They formed the Confederate States of America. Chose Jefferson Davis as their president, wrote a constitution that was almost identical to the United States Constitution. Except that it explicitly protected the institution of slavery. The war began at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861, when Confederate artillery opened fire on the Federal garrison there. A bombardment that lasted 34 hours, after which the Union garrison surrendered, without a single man killed. Both sides expected it to be short. Both sides were wrong. The Civil War lasted 4 years and consumed the nation in a way that nothing before or since has quite matched. It was fought not in distant lands, but in the fields and forests of Virginia, in the farms of Pennsylvania, in the red clay hills of Georgia, in the swamps of Mississippi, in places where people had grown up, where they had families, where they knew the land. At Antietam, in Maryland, on September 17, 1862, 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. In a single day. The bloodiest single day in American military history. Bodies lay in the cornfields and along the sunken road. So thick in some places that a person could walk on them without touching the earth. But it was after Antietam that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that all enslaved people in Confederate states were, from this day forward, free. It was a document of carefully limited scope. It did not apply to border states still in the Union. That it applied only to states in rebellion, states that Lincoln had no actual power over at that moment. But it changed the nature of the war. That it made the conflict explicitly about slavery. That it made the Union cause a cause of liberation. And it opened the door for black men to enlist in the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers fought for the Union. They fought in segregated regiments under mostly white officers, paid less than white soldiers, treated as less than equal in almost every way. And they fought with extraordinary courage, knowing that if captured, they would not be treated as prisoners of war, but executed or re-enslaved. They fought anyway. The war turned decisively in the summer of 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Over 3 days of fighting in July, the Confederate Army made its deepest push into Union territory and was turned back at a cost of more than 50,000 casualties on both sides in 3 days. 4 months later, Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg to dedicate a military cemetery for the Union. He spoke for 2 minutes, 2 minutes. After a 2-hour oration by a famous speaker named Edward Everett and yet it is Lincoln's words that are remembered. 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. The war ended on April 9th, 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Grant was generous in the terms. He offered Confederate soldiers were allowed to keep their horses, to return to their farms, to go home, no trials, no executions. He wanted the healing to begin. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington by an actor named John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who believed he was striking a blow for the South. Lincoln died the following morning. Never having seen the peace he had sacrificed everything to achieve. Part 10. Reconstruction and the Long Road. The years after the Civil War were years of extraordinary possibility and extraordinary failure. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery, granted citizenship to all people born in the United States, and guaranteed black men the right to vote. Black men were elected to Congress, to state legislatures, to positions of authority throughout the South. for a brief, remarkable period. The South was governed by coalitions of black voters, white Republicans from the North, and Southern whites who had opposed secession. Schools were built. Roads were built. A New South began to emerge, and then the federal troops were withdrawn. As part of a political compromise in 1877, that settled a disputed presidential election. And with the troops went the protection. What followed was a systematic and violent dismantling of everything. Reconstruction had built white supremacist groups. The Ku Klux Klan, the White League, the Red Shirts, used terror. Murder. Arson. To drive black voters from the polls. To remove black officials from office. To restore the racial hierarchy its slavery had embodied. Jim Crow laws, named mockingly for a caricature, were enacted across the South, legally mandating segregation in every aspect of life. Schools, hospitals, restaurants, hotels, trains, cemeteries, even the benches in public parks. The Supreme Court upheld this system in 1896. In the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, ruling that separate facilities could be equal. Separate but equal, the most consequential lie in American legal history, because the facilities were never equal, and everyone knew it. Into this world, Black Americans built institutions of extraordinary resilience. Churches that were the center of community life. Colleges that produced generations of doctors, lawyers, teachers. Newspapers that told the truth when the white press would not. Businesses and neighborhoods, and cultural traditions that survived under conditions designed to destroy them. A man named W.E.B. Du Bois, born in Massachusetts in 1868, the first Black American to earn a doctorate from Harvard. Founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In 1909, and spent his life writing and arguing and fighting for the full citizenship that the Constitution had promised, and the country refused to deliver. He wrote about what he called the double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Two warring ideals in one dark body, words written more than a century ago that still ring with terrible recognition. Part 11. The Industrial Age. While the South struggled under the weight of its history, the North was transforming itself at a speed that seems almost impossible to comprehend. In 1860, America was still largely an agricultural nation. By 1900, it was one of the greatest industrial powers on Earth. In 40 years. A transformation that had taken England a century. The railroads drove it. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. A golden spike driven at Promontory Summit in Utah, connecting the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. A journey that had once taken months by wagon could now be made in a week by train. The steel industry drove it. Andrew Carnegie, born poor in Scotland, had come to America as a child and built himself into the wealthiest man in the world through relentless efficiency and an almost supernatural understanding of industrial organization. His steel mills in Pittsburgh burned day and night, lighting the sky for miles, filling the air with smoke and the smell of molten metal, and producing the steel that built the railroads, the bridges, the skyscrapers, that were transforming American cities. The oil industry drove it. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil, into a monopoly, so complete, so dominant, that it controlled 90% of the oil refined in the United States. He was richer than some countries. These men, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt, were called the robber barons by those who saw them clearly, and captains of industry by those who admired them. They were, in different measures, both visionaries who built things that genuinely needed building, and ruthless men who destroyed competitors, corrupted politicians, and treated their workers as instruments rather than human beings. The workers, millions of them, poured into the industrial cities from two directions, from the farms of the American South and Midwest, and from the countries of Europe, Ireland and Germany and Italy, and Poland and Russia and Greece, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, from everywhere, drawn by the same dream that you could arrive with nothing, and if you were willing to work, you could build something. They arrived at Ellis Island, a small island in New York, harbored in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, which France had given to the United States in 1886, as a gesture of revolutionary solidarity between 1892 and 1954. More than 12 million people passed through Ellis Island, each one examined by doctors, each one questioned by inspectors, each one carrying everything they owned in a bundle or a trunk, each one carrying something invisible, and more important, the hope that had driven them to leave everything they knew. The cities they arrived in were overwhelming, noisy, dirty, extraordinary, new. York was already one of the great cities of the world. Chicago had risen from almost nothing in 50 years, to a city of more than 1 million people. Its stockyards processing so many animals that the smell of blood and offal could be detected from miles away, its grain elevators rising from the flatness of the plain, like steel cathedrals. The workers who built all of this lived in conditions that would be unrecognizable today. 12-hour days, 6 days a week, children, as young as 8, working in coal mines and textile mills. No safety regulations, no compensation if you were injured, no pension when you were too old to work, no unemployment insurance if you were let go, And so the workers organized. In unions. In political movements. In strikes that were sometimes met with private armies hired by the companies. And with violence. The labor movement was built by people who had nothing, who had everything to lose and still went on strike, who were beaten and jailed and killed for the right to an 8-hour workday. For the right to a weekend, for the right to not be killed by their employer's negligence, and to have someone pay for their medical care when they were. Rights that once won. Were so obvious that later generations forgot they had ever had to be fought for. Part 12. The world wars let your body sink even deeper now, into the warmth and safety of wherever you are. We are moving into the 20th century. Century that began with such optimism, such absolute confidence in progress. In the power of human reason and technology to improve the world. And then. In the summer of 1914. An Austrian Archduke was shot dead in Sarajevo, and the interlocking alliances of European powers, like dominoes. Fell, one after another, into war. The First World War was unlike anything that had come before. Industrial technology applied to killing. Machine guns. Poison gas. Barbed wire. The airplane. The submarine. All deployed against human beings with a thoroughness and efficiency that left the fields of France and Belgium strewn with the bodies of an entire generation. America stayed out for 3 years, selling supplies to both sides, declaring neutrality, arguing among itself about whether this European catastrophe was any of its business, until German submarines began sinking American ships, until a secret telegram was intercepted, in which Germany offered Mexico the states of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. In exchange for joining the war against the United States. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war. American soldiers crossed the Atlantic, fresh, untouched by 3 years of grinding attrition. And helped tip the balance. The war ended on November 11th, 1918. At 11 o'clock in the morning. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. A ceasefire across the whole vast Western Front. The silence that followed. Must have been extraordinary. After 4 years of artillery and machine guns and gas. Suddenly. Silence. The birds returning to the trees. Men who had not heard bird song in years. Standing in the mud and the wire, listening. The 1920s followed. A decade of jazz and cinema and automobiles and electricity. Of flappers and speakeasies. Of Charles Lindbergh flying alone across the Atlantic. Of Louis Armstrong redefining what music could be. Of the Harlem Renaissance. That extraordinary flowering of black art and literature and music. In the neighborhood of Upper Manhattan, or Langston. Hughes wrote poems, and Zora Neale Hurston wrote novels. And Duke Ellington played jazz. That was unlike anything the world had ever heard. And then, on October 24th, 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression that followed Dot was not just an economic catastrophe. It was a psychological one. The promise of America, the idea that hard work and determination led to prosperity, seemed suddenly hollow, mocked by the long lines of men waiting for soup. By the farms foreclosed, and auctioned off. By the families living in cardboard cities. Called, with bitter irony, HOOVERVILLE, after President Herbert Hoover. Who seemed unable to understand what was happening, or to do anything about it. Into this darkness came Franklin Roosevelt, elected president in 1932. In a wheelchair. Having lost the use of his legs. To polio at 30-9. Having refused to let it define him. Having become, if anything, more empathetic, more human. For having suffered. He spoke to the American people on the radio. Calm. Warm. Direct. He called these talks fireside chats. And across the country. In living rooms and kitchens and barns, people gathered around their radios to listen to the voice of a man who seemed to understand what they were going through. Who seemed to believe that it could be survived. The only thing we have to fear. Is fear itself. He put people to work building roads and bridges and dams, planting trees, writing the histories of their communities, painting murals in post offices, recording folk songs before they were lost. He created Social Security, the foundation of the modern safety net. He reformed the banking system. He regulated the financial markets. He saved American capitalism from its own excesses, and many of the people he saved hated him for it. But the Depression ended slowly. Painfully. And what finally ended it. Was another war. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese carrier-based aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in a coordinated strike that lasted less than 2 hours. 2,403 Americans were killed. 19 ships were sunk or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. The following day, Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. Congress declared war. America was in. The country mobilized with a speed and efficiency that still seems almost miraculous. Factories that had made cars were converted to make tanks in a matter of months. Women entered the workforce in numbers never seen before, building the ships and planes and weapons that the war required. The image of Rosie, the riveter, a woman in a blue work shirt and red bandana, muscles flexed. Eyes determined, "We can do it," became a symbol of something that was genuinely true. American forces fought in North Africa, got then in Sicily and Italy. Then, on the morning of June 6th, 1944, in the largest seaborne invasion in the history of warfare, on the beaches of Normandy, France, D-Day, 150,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel in darkness, hitting 5 beaches at dawn under withering fire. Young men from Iowa and Georgia and New York and California, running up beaches they had never seen before, into fire they could not have imagined, many of them dying in the first seconds, many of them surviving and pushing forward anyway. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Hitler, dead by his own hand in a bunker in Berlin. Germany surrendered, but the war in the Pacific continued until August when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, weapons of a destructive power the world had never seen, killing between 120,000 and 220,000 people, the vast majority of them civilians. It ended the war in days when years of conventional fighting might not have, but it opened a door that could never be closed again. The door to a world in which human beings possessed the power to end themselves. Part 13, The Long Struggle for Equality America, emerged from the Second World War as the most powerful nation on earth, its factories intact, its territory unharmed, its economy transformed by wartime, production into something the world had never quite seen before. But at home, the contradictions had not been resolved. The black soldiers who came home from the war, having fought for freedom in Europe and the Pacific, came home to Jim Crow, came home to separate water fountains and bus seats and schools, came home to a country that valued their service, but refused to grant them the dignity of full citizenship, the patience that had sustained the community for so long. Was running out. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a city bus after a long day of work, and sat in the first row of the section, designated for black passengers. When the white section filled up, and the bus driver ordered her to give her seat to a white man, she said no. She was arrested, charged with violating city segregation ordinances, and that night, the black community of Montgomery, led by a group of women who had been planning exactly this kind of action for months, organized a boycott. They would not ride the buses for 381 days. Every single day, the black community of Montgomery walked to work. Car pooled. Endured harassment, endured violence, endured the pressure of a white establishment that could not believe that people who had been told they had no power were refusing to accept that verdict. A 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King, Jr., emerged as the spokesman and leader of the boycott. He was young. He was brilliant. He was afraid. He received death threats. His home was bombed. His family was endangered. And he kept going, drawing on a theological tradition of nonviolent resistance, drawing on the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, drawing on the deep wells of faith and community that had sustained Black Americans through everything. The boycott won. The Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's bus segregation was unconstitutional, and a movement had found its feet. Sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom rides on interstate buses. Marches. Demonstrations. Children facing fire hoses and police dogs in Birmingham. Moment broadcast on television into living rooms across the country. That made it impossible for anyone to pretend they didn't know. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, a march on Washington for jobs and freedom, the largest civil rights demonstration in American history. And Martin Luther King, Jr. stood on the steps of the memorial. And he reached into the traditions of the Black church. And the traditions of American idealism, and he wove them together into something that had never quite existed before. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up. And live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 guaranteed Black Americans the right to vote, protections that had been in the Constitution for a century and had been systematically denied. Martin Luther King, Jr. was assassinated on April 4, 1968, standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 39 years old. The dream did not die with him. It has never died. It has been deferred. It has been challenged. It has been fought over and argued about and tested. But it has never died. Part 14. The Cold War and Beyond. After the Second World War. Two great powers faced each other across a divided world. The United States and the Soviet Union. Each armed with nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization. Each watching the other with a suspicion that never quite became open war, but never quite resolved into peace. The Cold War shaped everything. The space race. The arms race. The proxy wars fought in Korea and Vietnam. Where Americans died not to defend their own territory, but in the service of a global competition whose stakes they did not always understand. The Vietnam War was the most painful of these. A war that began with absolute certainty and ended with absolute doubt. 58,000 Americans killed, millions of Vietnamese killed, country torn apart by the question of whether it should have been fought at all. Young men burning their draft cards. Veterans coming home to a country that didn't know how to treat them. But the Cold War also produced moments of extraordinary human achievement. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong stepped from the ladder of the Apollo 11 lunar module onto the surface of the moon and spoke words that had been prepared for the occasion, but which still, somehow, managed to feel true. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. 500 million people watched on television, on a grainy, black and white transmission. From 250,000 miles away, a human footprint in the lunar dust. The Cold War ended not with the bang that everyone had feared, but with a kind of slow, exhausted release. The Soviet system, burdened by its own contradictions, simply began to come apart. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. The concrete barrier that had divided a city for 28 years was attacked by ordinary people with hammers and their bare hands. Piece by piece, through the night, until the first light of morning found a city reunited. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, and the Cold War that had shaped every aspect of American life for 45 years was over. The continuing story America is an unfinished thing. It has always been unfinished. That is perhaps both its greatest weakness and its greatest strength. The ideals written into the founding documents, those extraordinary words, all men are created equal, have always exceeded the reality. There has always been a gap between what America said it was and what it actually was. But the gap has also always provoked argument and action. And change. The abolitionists pointed to the gap. The suffragettes who fought for women's right to vote. And won it with the 19th Amendment in 1920 pointed to the gap. The labor movement pointed to the gap. The civil rights movement pointed to the gap. Each generation of Americans. Has been required to decide what the words actually mean, whether to take them seriously, whether the promise is worth keeping. The story continues. In ways that no one can predict, written by ordinary people. Making quiet decisions. At kitchen tables and in voting booths. In classrooms and courtrooms. In the streets and the halls of power. Pluribus unum. Out of many. One. Words on a seal, but also a question that each generation must answer for itself, whether it is possible, whether it is worth trying, whether the many can truly become one without losing what makes each of them particular and precious. The answer is not obvious. It has never been obvious. It is worked out. Imperfectly. Painfully. Sometimes beautifully. Day by day. The return to sleep you have traveled far tonight, across oceans and centuries, through wars and harvests, through the best and the worst that human beings are capable of. You have walked with the first people across the land bridge. 14,000 years ago, you have stood on the shore as the sails appeared on the horizon. You have sat in the hold of the Mayflower in the cold and the dark, listening to 41 exhausted people decide to govern themselves. You have stood in the tobacco fields of Virginia and in the cotton fields of Mississippi. You have followed the North, star through the night. With Harriet Tubman's hand firm and steady on your arm. You have heard the cannons at Fort Sumter and the silence after Appomattox. You have stood in the crowd at Gettysburg, listening to 2 minutes of words that would last forever. You have crossed the Atlantic in a troop ship and landed on a beach in Normandy. At dawn, you have watched a footprint form in lunar dust. 250,000 miles from Earth, you have stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and heard a young minister with a dream speak it into the summer air. And heard it echo, still echoing. Let it all settle now. All of it. The great and the terrible. The inspiring and the simply heartbreaking. Let it sink down into you like sediment, sinking slowly to the bottom of a deep and still lake. The continent is vast and quiet beneath you, the same stars that guided the first people southward through a new world. Still turning slowly overhead. The same moon that lit Harriet Tubman's path through the Maryland night, still hanging in the sky. You are part of this story. Every person alive is part of this story, whether they know it or not. The story runs through all of us. But tonight, the story rests. Let your body become heavy. As heavy as the earth beneath you. Let your thoughts drift. Like leaves on a slow river, moving without effort, without destination. Just drifting. Your breathing is slow. Your body is warm. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to understand, nothing you need to hold. The history is safe. It will be there in the morning. Patient and permanent. Waiting for you to return to it. But not yet. For now, there is only this, the quiet dark, the slow tide of your breathing. In, out, in, and out. The long story of America. Rests around you like the land itself. Ancient and still. Sleep now, gently, deeply. The story continues tomorrow, but not yet, not for a long time yet. Sleep, sleep. The stars are turning slowly overhead. The rivers are moving quietly toward the sea. The story goes on, but you are still and warm and safe. Sleep, sleep,